This lecture follows the Carolingian era with that of the Romanesque, literally Roman-like, where we find the reemergence of large-scale stone sculpture and architecture for the first time since antiquity. The Romanesque era, as seen here, will find the Holy Roman Empire once again overlapping Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and northern Italy, and then the Kingdom of France slowly taking shape, whereas the Norman kingdom in the north, of course founded by the Normans themselves and Normandy, and of course they will control southern Italy and Sicily. Romanesque, literally Roman-like, for it was believed that the architecture at this time looked like Roman architecture. We have a breakdown of feudalism, the system of government and economics that is going to have held true through the early Middle Ages, where land-owning lords would grant property to vassals. In turn, these peasants would work the land in exchange for protection from that lord. Now, the economy around the year 1000 is still primarily agrarian, but what we are seeing now is the growth of cities and urbanization that will be the foundation for the Renaissance to follow. At this time, we have large-scale stone architecture re-emerging. The stone vaulting becomes more common in church and monastic architecture, and we find that timber roofs are really only retained in Italy in relationship to the early Christian architecture that preceded it there, like St. Paul outside the walls or Santa Sabina. Here, in an early example of Romanesque architecture, we have the Church of Saint Vincent. In this, we have masonry vaults and stone construction, and we can see in the structure the repeated shape that would come to define the Romanesque. Inside, we can see the barrel vault, which is continued throughout the nave and the side aisles, and of course continues the shape even in the windows. This is going to enhance the acoustics. The acoustical effect of these Gregorian chants are going to be designed specifically for these types of structures, reverberating the spiritual echo of the choir. The barrel vault is actually just an arch shape or a true Roman arch that is repeated and continued along an axis. That repeated shape of the arch then gives you a ceiling. The shape which is dominant is that arch, so we can find the repeated arch shape not only in the barrel vault, but in the side chapels as well as the window. This is going to be the defining characteristic for Romanesque architecture. At this time, we find that monasticism will spread, especially in the Benedictine monasteries, whereby monks are going to take a vow of poverty, chastity, and are going to seclude themselves from modern life. They, of course, are going to become the greatest patrons of the arts and remain the cultural centers that they were in the early Middle Ages, very often being the only places where people were literate. But they are also responsible for copying illuminated manuscripts and books of all kind, especially those brought back from the Crusades. For there are two new cultural forces at play in the Romanesque era that explains the explosion in buildings. One is pilgrimages. Second are the Crusades. Both of these are going to be sponsored and fostered by the Church. We often forget that the Crusades actually saved Europe, taking it out of the Dark Ages. For when the Crusaders, bent on returning Jerusalem, the home of Christ, to Christian hands, once they recapture it in 1099 and slaughter all the Muslims inside, we find that they bring back the cultural treasures of the Arab nations that were controlling it. They bring back Homer, Plato, Aristotle, these classical texts that are then copied by monks, providing the groundwork for a new type of belief system in humanism to follow. Now, thanks to the prosperity of cities and the relief that the population had for the world not ending at the millennium, we have these large-scale building enterprises to thank God for sparing Europe and the Western world. Every millennium, of course, is going to find religious hysteria, for the end of the world is always believed to occur on a nice, even 1,000-year marker. When that did not happen, we build these pilgrimage churches that are going to house relics from the saints and celebrate the cult of the saints. And we can travel to these churches if we are unable to make our way all the way to Rome or Jerusalem. We can travel locally in Western Europe, in France, Spain, and modern-day Portugal. In fact, here are the pilgrimage routes for those that are going to crop up along them, building churches with new saints to venerate along the way. We can see that individuals would travel from the Holy Roman Empire and northern Italy, all the way through Toulouse, Moissac, Conques, all of these important routes that would lead to Santiago de Compostela, which is going to be the burial for St. James. Pilgrims are thus going to feature prominently on church architecture with the reemergence of large-scale stone sculpture as well. Here we have Christ and his disciples on the road to Emmaus. So like Christ, we too should be a pilgrim, and we too should take a pilgrimage to see these holy places and relics. Here we have the description taken from Luke 24, where Christ and his disciples are on the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and they are dressed as pilgrims, importantly. We find the attributes of pilgrims here with the hat, the satchel, and the walking stick, all carried by those who would be on pilgrimage. We can see it here almost like a candy cane-like design in Christ's left hand, as well as the satchel with the shell on it just below. The scallop shell, in fact, was picked up by pilgrims as evidence of their journey. They would make their way all the way to the Atlantic Ocean to show that they had actually succeeded and made it. This would then be a passport to get shelter on the road. They would show this to any town they came to, and they were expected to receive hospitality and lodgings for the evening. We still find to this day these shells are still sold at the cathedral here at Santiago de Compostela. The figural style, as we left off last time, is going to be heavily indebted to that Byzantine style, which is attenuated and, of course, defined by contours, stylization, and outlines. The elongated forms, the curving contours, the bearded faces and large wide eyes, all of which derive from the Ottonian style, which directly precedes the Romanesque. These pilgrims, as we are emulating Christ, are going to take these main routes, one of four, which eventually lead all the way down to Santiago de Compostela. The destination is going to be the apostle who was sent to the Iberian Peninsula to spread the message of Christ. Here we have the Cathedral of St. James itself, with numerous additions and certainly a much later facade, as you can see here. This is going to be an 18th century or a late Baroque facade, heavily encrusted. Now, the tomb of St. James, the apostle to the Iberian Peninsula, can be found within, and that is the destination of pilgrims, to walk to these vast, faraway cities in order to catch a glimpse of the relics of a saint, to pray to them, to ask for a favor, and then to leave. This leads to a new type of church and a demand for a new type of church, a pilgrimage church. It is still going to retain that Latin cross plan with an elongated longitudinal axis on the nave, with a shorter transept and forming a crossing. But we have a new system inside for maneuvering through the church. As we will discuss shortly, entering into the portals for pilgrims, we have several sculptural decorations intended for us, to greet us and to introduce us to what we will see within. The shapes one sees in St. James should remind one of the earliest Romanesque churches, for we have heavy, weighty masonry, much like we talked about at the Palatine Chapel of Charlemagne. We have a repeated series of arch shapes in the barrel vault, in the side aisles, and in the windows themselves. This is the Romanesque or Roman-like quality of the architecture, that is, the repeated arch. Now, the Roman arch is going to define the interior space, which is not incredibly tall. Instead, we are emphasizing structural clarity, and then, once again, the repeated shapes here within would remind us of the pilgrimage that we have undertaken. A pilgrimage church is going to serve not just pilgrims, but the local population, for they need to receive Mass as well regularly. And there is no telling if you're going to be walking from France, Germany, or northern Italy when you might arrive. And so we find we have two different populations, and we need to account for them. So here we have the nave, the crossing, and the transept. But notice we have additional radiating chapels and an ambulatory in the apse. That is because pilgrimage churches must accommodate large crowds that need to move in and out of the structure unimpeded at any time of the day. So this structure is even larger than Old St. Peter's, 30 feet longer in fact, and it is 230 feet wide. Now, as we are going to enter as pilgrims through the transept, and locals would enter through the west portal, we would walk through the transept around, through this walkway, this ambulatory, to see the various chapels, these radiating chapels, to light a votive candle, to leave money, to ask these saints for their blessings, for their favors, and then walk out without interrupting Mass that is occurring for the local population directly, once again, west of us. So we can easily move through and then reach these relics and then leave. The plan looks a lot like the earlier plans, including the side aisles of Old St. Peter's and these basilica types. However, it continues those side aisles all the way around the structure, around the transept, and around the apse itself. Thus, it is going to physically separate the two populations, serving two different goals. Here we have the interior, where you can see the local population worshiping at the high altar, and then the side aisles, which are going to allow us to walk around without disturbing them. Pilgrims, of course, would travel from hundreds of miles away, if not thousands, to see the reliquaries. Now, reliquaries are going to be sculptural structures that hold and protect a relic, which is associated with the holy person, generally a part of their body, but could also be something that they touched. Here in the reliquary statue of Sainte Foy, or Saint Faith, we have an example of a child martyr whose skull is located within this structure and is taken out periodically to venerate. Note that we have this as an example of holy robbery, for the relics of Sainte Foy were going to be taken by the monks at Conques because they insisted that the saint had wanted them to steal her relics and move her there. This, of course, is a shrewd business move because people will come from miles around to leave money at your monastery to ask for the saint's favor. Therefore, we need to suggest how significant this saint is, and of course the worship of the saint by bejeweling it, encrusting it with all of these layers of gold, of precious metals and jewels. The presentation of the saint who is facing in a forward fashion on a throne would remind us of the Theotokos, or the Mother of God, as we are going to directly engage with her so she can intercede on our behalf. So in a spiritual fashion, she is going to do us a favor. She will help us. Along the route to see these reliquaries, multiple churches would pop up to service the pilgrims as they voyaged. Here is one of the examples at Saint-Savin-sur-Gartempe, where we find a rare example of fresco from the period. Here in the Abbey Church of Saint-Savin-sur-Gartempe at Poitou, we're going to find that the barrel-vaulted ceiling is painted, and we find that the painters would have followed closely behind the masons, thus observing how they were building the structure. This is known because they include anecdotal details from the masons' practices. This can be seen, for instance, in the Tower of Babel, the Old Testament story, which is going to explain in an ideological fashion the emergence of the polyglot, or multiple languages. For in Genesis 11, God, here represented as Christ to the left, just like in the doors of St. Michael's at Hildesheim we discussed, is going to punish the building of the tower. For the peoples are trying to make their way to heaven. God finds this to be blasphemous and boastful, so he confuses their tongue, so they are unable to communicate on how to build any longer. The figures, you'll note, are still going to be using the traditional gestural language that we talked about earlier, as Christ with the cruciform halo turns his back on the figures, rebuking them, again with his left hand. They, in turn, elongated but very clear, are going to be building the structure that we are standing in. So we can see the barrel vault, and we can see how they are laying the dressed brick and stone. Now we find that the Tower of Babel was actually going to be one of these ziggurats we discussed from the ancient Near East. And of course we find the Hebrews, rightfully so, interpreted them as stairways to heaven, or as the locals trying to build their way to the heavens to see the gods. For that's what they were temples or waiting rooms for the gods. This was presumptuous to the Hebrews, and so this is going to inspire their story of the Tower of Babel. Though it might strike us as unusual that they choose a contemporary architectural ensemble and setting to locate us in this ancient tale, this is quite common in the early and later Middle Ages, for we find that they make it relatable and relevant to the audience at hand, showing them structures they would see as the tallest that have ever been seen at that time, to relate to it, just as we see here at the right, locating us at Nahor, with the medieval or late antique, again, city here in the background to the right. The figures, again, are going to be taken from that Ottonian figural tradition, as they are elongated, the eyes large and emphasized, the gestures very clear, and the figures attenuated and stylized. Turning to the development of church facades and sculptural decoration, the largest sculptural ornaments would be found in the Romanesque era on church portals or entryways. This is when we find that mute facades, such as that at Saint Vincent, which does not have decorative elements, will be replaced by speaking facades, as they will become known. The Romanesque church portal would develop in complexity and eventually evolve into the Gothic portal. Here we find that theological messages could be conveyed to a very wide public audience, for we have the largest area above the doorway, the tympanum, will be used, the semicircular lunette, for large sculptural reliefs that will eventually show Last Judgments. Below you have the lintel, or a horizontal beam, supported by a trumeau and door jambs, and above we find archivolts and voussoirs, the stones that are going to make up the archway. All of these various elements would eventually be decorated with figural designs and relief sculptures. An example of this can be found at Saint-Pierre-et-Moissac, another city and church along the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. In the entryway for pilgrims, we have a scene that will develop into a Last Judgment format here shortly. The tympanum, again, is the largest area above the doorway, giving us the largest space and place to showcase these iconographic motifs. Here, the most common theme found on these church tympana will be the second coming of Christ, shown here as the king and judge of the Last Judgment. This is appropriate because in several verses in the New Testament, Christ is referred to as the door. In John 10, for instance, he is referred to as the door of salvation, for he states, "I am the door. Who enters through me will be saved." So we enter through the church doors. We can gain salvation. We enter, of course, salvation through and thanks to Christ. Here in the second coming, we have the vision of Christ as described in the book of Revelations. We find that there are rippling bands, a sea of glass like crystal, described in Revelations chapter 4. There are 24 elders with gold crowns on their heads directly below that rippling sea of glass. Here we have a detail of it to illustrate this vision that is going to be recounted by St. John the Evangelist, as all of these elders anxiously look up for Christ's last judgment. Christ above can be identified with the cruciform halo or equidistant Greek cross. On either side of him, we have the symbols of the gospel writers and then angels. He holds up 2 fingers in the blessing of benediction with his right hand. With his left, he supports his teachings, his writings. Here are the 4 evangelists that are going to be symbolized with the bull, the winged lion, the eagle, and the angel, or Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, thus, of course, showing us in the book that he has opened that says Pax Vobis, or peace be with you, that he is going to have communicated his teachings through the gospel writers themselves. Angels on either side as well are very elongated and hold scrolls recording the deeds of humans. Thus, of course, we will be judged based on what we have done on earth, and then based on the teachings of Christ, whether or not we gain salvation and everlasting life after that. The figures here can be seen on either side with the very long bodies of the angels unfurling these scrolls. Below, we also have the same elongation carried out in Old Testament figures, as we find one is going to be crossing his legs and twisting, supporting the door jamb in between. The position is important because the Old Testament prophets and the Old Testament itself literally support the New Testament above. Hence, we have a typological association between the two. That being, the Old Testament prophesies that there will be a Messiah that will come. Here we have a detail of this Old Testament prophet, possibly Jeremiah or Isaiah. He, of course, holds his own writings unfurled, just as the angels do above. 6 lions on the outer face are going to be appropriate here for kings and barons, for if you remember, Richard the Lionhearted is going to be nicknamed as such. They also were going to make great guardian figures, for it was believed that they slept with their eyes open, making them ideal to guard gateways, to keep Satan at bay outside of the church, just as the dragons on the gables of stave churches in Scandinavia keep trolls away. The function is the same as the lamassu and other guardian figures we discussed in the ancient Near East. As an apotropaic device, they ward off evil, guarding diligently against those that would wish to harm us, physically or spiritually. Now, in the next door section, which is a shelter for pilgrims stopping over from Santiago on their way, we find a series of reliefs that are dedicated to the punishment and wages of sin. The 2 most feared sins in the Middle Ages, in fact, are going to be avarice or greed and lust. Here we find that these demons are going to weigh down these greedy men who hold bags of money around their necks, showing us, of course, that if we are greedy, we're going to be plagued by these demonic creatures that are going to hold us down, weighing us down, keeping us away from salvation. Above, we see the wages of that greed as a man is going to be shown here on his deathbed, his soul being ripped from his body by these demons, as another holds a bag of money over the lower part of his body. Thus, of course, he was focused on the wrong thing, while his widow cries next to him, and an angel at the top of the scene is going to show us that he should pray. He should once again have been focused on the next life instead of the money he was losing and could not take with him in this life. This will become in the later Middle Ages the Ars Moriendi, or the Art of Dying Well, a series on the secular side of illustrations showing us how we should live the very end of our lives, preparing for death, appropriately praying and being pious. Above the scene, we find that we have an illustration from Luke, as Lazarus and Dives, this greedy rich man, is going to be feasting off here to the right and refuses to give any to the leprous beggar Lazarus. We find that here dogs are going to lick the pus from his sores as he lays dying. The angel then transports his soul, taking it from his mouth, to the lap of Abraham in paradise. So what we have here then is the last judgment of Christ returning at the second coming, while on the other side we have the torments for sin. These would be the model for later tympanum scenes in the Romanesque, when we have the official judgment of Christ with the promise of salvation and seeing heaven, and then those that are cast down to hell and are tormented for it. Thus, of course, communicating to this audience of pilgrims why they are going on pilgrimage, that they are in fact going to be praying for their very souls. Next time, we'll continue on with the late Romanesque and an even further building explosion that occurs at that time.